The summer of 1956 was hot. In the Middle East, it was hotter still. The tensions had been building for years. They were a complex brew of post-colonial pride, Cold War politics, and regional animosity. At the center of it all was a man and a waterway. The man was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic president of Egypt. The waterway was the Suez Canal. It was a vital artery for global trade, especially for oil flowing from the Persian Gulf to Europe. For decades, it had been controlled by the British and the French through the Suez Canal Company. To Nasser, it was a symbol of foreign domination on Egyptian soil. He wanted it back. For Britain and France, the canal was more than just a commercial asset. It was a vestige of their imperial power, a power that was rapidly fading in the post-World War II era. They saw Nasser as a threat. He was a champion of Pan-Arabism, a movement that sought to unite Arab nations and throw off the yoke of Western influence. His rhetoric was fiery. His ambitions were grand. He supported Algerian rebels fighting against French rule. He broadcast anti-British propaganda across the region. For Israel, the situation was existential. The new state, born in 1948, was surrounded by hostile Arab neighbors who refused to recognize its existence. Egypt was the most powerful of them. Nasser had blockaded the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's southern port of Eilat. He sponsored cross-border raids by Palestinian militants known as the Fedayeen, who terrorized Israeli border communities. The final catalyst came in July 1956. The United States and Great Britain, wary of Nasser's growing ties to the Soviet bloc, withdrew their offer to finance the Aswan High Dam. Humiliated and furious, Nasser responded dramatically. On July 26th, speaking to a massive crowd in Alexandria, he announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. The canal, he declared, would now belong to the Egyptian people. Its revenues would pay for the dam. The Arab world erupted in celebration. In the wake of the nationalization, a flurry of secret diplomacy began. Publicly, Britain and France pursued a diplomatic solution, but privately they prepared for military action. The most important of these was held in a secluded villa in Sèvres, a suburb of Paris, from October 22nd to the 24th. There, representatives from France, Britain and Israel hammered out a secret agreement. It would become known as the Protocol of Sèvres. The plan was intricate, a piece of geopolitical theater designed to deceive the world. Israel would launch a large-scale attack on Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula, driving towards the Suez Canal. This was the cue for Britain and France. They would then issue an ultimatum to both Egypt and Israel, demanding they withdraw their forces 10 miles from the canal zone. It was a masterful piece of trickery. They knew Israel would accept. Its forces would still be deep inside Egyptian territory. They also knew Nasser would reject it. He could never agree to cede sovereign Egyptian land. The plan went into motion on the afternoon of October 29, 1956. The Israeli phase of the operation was codenamed Kadesh, a reference to an ancient city in the Sinai. It began not with a massive armored assault, but with a daring airborne drop. At 5:00 p.m., 16 Israeli C-47 Dakota transport planes flew low over the Sinai Desert. They were escorted by jet fighters. Their target was the Mitla Pass, a strategic choke point deep inside the peninsula, about 40 miles east of the Suez Canal. The main ground invasion began simultaneously. Israeli forces crossed the border at several points. The Israeli strategy was one of speed and shock, a blitzkrieg designed to overwhelm the Egyptian defenders before they could mount a coherent response. They used French-made AMX-13 light tanks and American M4 Sherman tanks, modified and upgraded by Israeli engineers. Egypt's military command was caught by surprise. They had expected a potential attack, but the scale and audacity of the Israeli thrust were shocking. As dawn broke on October 30th, the Sinai Peninsula had become a sprawling battlefield. The Israeli defense forces pressed their advantage with relentless speed. The battle for the Abu Aguila complex was crucial. It was a formidable defensive position, protected by minefields, trenches, and well-sighted artillery. The initial Israeli assaults were repulsed. However, Ariel Sharon, ever the aggressive commander, exceeded his orders. He pushed his forces into the Mitla Pass itself, where they were ambushed by well-entrenched Egyptian units. Their forces in the Sinai were substantial, composed of infantry divisions supported by Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks and Su-100 tank destroyers, but they were spread out in static defensive positions, unprepared for the rapid mobile warfare that the Israelis had unleashed. By November 1st, the Egyptian command in the Sinai was beginning to collapse. Faced with the Anglo-French ultimatum and the threat of an invasion of the Canal Zone itself, Nasser made a fateful decision. He ordered a general withdrawal of all Egyptian forces from the Sinai Peninsula. The retreat quickly turned into a rout. Israeli forces, controlling the key roads and the skies above, harried the fleeing Egyptian columns, inflicting heavy casualties and capturing vast quantities of equipment. With the Israeli invasion well underway, the carefully scripted next act began. On October 30th, Britain and France issued their pre-arranged ultimatum. They called on both Egypt and Israel to cease hostilities and withdraw to positions 10 miles on either side of the Suez Canal. As planned, Israel accepted. Egypt, as expected, rejected it. Operation Musketeer, the Anglo-French invasion, was now greenlit. The military force assembled for Musketeer was formidable. It was a vast armada of over 100 warships, including aircraft carriers like the British HMS Eagle and HMS Albion, and the French Arromanches and Lafayette. The air campaign began on the evening of October 31st. British Canberra bombers and carrier-based aircraft struck Egyptian airfields around Cairo and the Nile Delta. The goal was to destroy the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. However, Nasser, anticipating such an attack, had dispersed many of his modern Soviet-made MiG-15 and Ilyushin Il-28 aircraft to bases in Syria and Saudi Arabia. While the Anglo-French air forces did achieve air supremacy, they failed to deliver the knockout blow they had intended. The bombing also caused civilian casualties, which began to turn world opinion against the intervention. The assault on Port Said began at dawn on November 5th. The first wave consisted of British paratroopers from the 3rd Battalion, Parachute Regiment. They were dropped onto El Gamil airfield, just west of the city. French paratroopers of the 2nd RPC were dropped south of the city to seize key bridges and the waterworks. The airborne assault was largely successful, securing its primary objectives against scattered but determined Egyptian resistance. The amphibious landing took place the next day on November 6th. British Royal Marines from 40 and 42 Commando stormed the beaches of Port Said. They were some of the first troops to be deployed into combat from helicopters, a tactic that was still in its infancy. The city's defenders, a mix of regular army units and civilian militia, fought back fiercely. The fighting was street by street, house by house. Snipers fired from rooftops and windows. The Anglo-French forces, with their superior firepower, slowly ground down the resistance. The battle for the city was brutal and controversial. The naval bombardment and aerial attacks that preceded the landing had caused significant damage and civilian casualties. That evening, under overwhelming international pressure, British Prime Minister Anthony Eden announced that his government would accept a United Nations ceasefire effective at midnight. While soldiers fought in the deserts of Sinai and the streets of Port Said, the real war was being waged in the halls of power in New York and Washington. President Eisenhower felt personally betrayed by his closest allies, Britain and France. The timing was also terrible, coming at the same time as the Soviet Union's brutal crackdown on the Hungarian uprising. The Soviet invasion of Hungary gave the West a powerful moral high ground in the Cold War, but the Anglo-French attack on Egypt shattered it. But it was American economic power that proved to be the decisive weapon. The invasion had triggered a run on the British pound. Britain's currency reserves were plummeting. Eisenhower's response was cold and clear. There would be no help until Britain agreed to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. The ceasefire came into effect at midnight on November 6, 1956. The withdrawal was a slow and humiliating process. Under the watchful eyes of the world and the newly arrived blue-helmeted UN peacekeepers, the Anglo-French forces began to pull out in late November. For Gamal Abdel Nasser, it was a moment of incredible triumph. He had been attacked by two former colonial powers and the strongest military in the region, yet he remained in power. He had lost the military battle but had won an overwhelming political victory. For Israel, the outcome was more complex. Militarily, Operation Kadesh had been a spectacular success. However, under intense pressure from the United States, Israel was also forced to withdraw its forces from the Sinai and the Gaza Strip. The withdrawal was completed in March 1957. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was a watershed moment. It redrew the political map of the Middle East and signaled a definitive shift in the global balance of power. For Britain and France, the consequences were catastrophic. The failed intervention was a national humiliation that exposed their declining influence. It shattered the illusion that they were still first-rate world powers. The crisis accelerated the decline of the British and French colonial empires. The United States emerged from the crisis as the undisputed dominant power broker in the region. The crisis also opened the door for greater Soviet influence in the Middle East. The region was left more polarized, more militarized, and more central to the Cold War than ever before. The seeds of the next war, the Six-Day War of 1967, were sown in the sands of the Sinai and the political fallout of 1956.